December 16th, 1943. The frigid waters of the North Atlantic heaved and churned beneath a steel-grey sky as Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann guided U-371 through the chaotic sea, confident in the natural protection the storm provided against Allied detection. At a depth of 80 meters, he believed his Type 6C U-boat was practically invisible to the American destroyers that hunted above. A hunter who believed himself to be the predator, unaware he had already become the prey. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how American technological innovation turned the tables in the Battle of the Atlantic, and how one German U-boat commander came to realize the rules of the game had fundamentally changed without his knowledge. The cramped confines of U-371 carried the familiar sense of diesel, sweat, and the lingering aroma of the morning's sauerkraut rations. Hoffmann moved carefully through the control room, his tall frame navigating the tight space with practiced ease developed over 3 years of submarine warfare. His 44-man crew operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each sailor knowing that their lives depended on perfect execution of their duties. Herr Kalou, hydrophone reports are clear. No propeller sounds within detection range, reported Lieutenant Zur C. Werner Schmidt, the boat's executive officer. At 27, Schmidt was considered an old man in the U-boat service, where the average age hovered around 22. Hoffmann nodded, satisfied. Excellent. We will continue on this heading. The convoy must be within striking distance by morning. The storm above will mask our approach. This was to be Hoffmann's 8th patrol. His previous 7 had yielded an impressive tally: 14 Allied ships sunk, approximately 87,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom. His success had earned him the Knight's Cross, and U-371 had become one of the most successful boats operating from the French port of La Pallice. Radio message from BDU Herr Kalou, called the radio man, referring to Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, the U-boat headquarters under Admiral Karl Dönitz. Hoffmann took the decoded message and read it carefully. We are to form a new wolf pack with U-257 and U-406, codename Wolfsfalle. We will intercept convoy on 219 at coordinates provided. The crew received this news with quiet determination. Wolfpack tactics had proven devastatingly effective earlier in the war. Multiple U-boats would coordinate their attacks on Allied convoys, striking from different directions simultaneously, overwhelming the escort vessels. Schmidt, plot the new course. I want our position relative to the projected convoy route. Jawohl, Herr Kalou. What Hoffmann and his crew didn't know, what no U-boat commander had fully grasped at this stage of the war, was that the technological advantage they had enjoyed during the happy time of 1940-1941 had evaporated. American destroyers were now equipped with the QC sonar set, an advanced active sonar system that could detect submarines even when the destroyer was moving at speeds up to 30 knots. The German Naval Command still operated under the belief that sonar was only effective when escort vessels were moving at slow speeds or were stationary. 400 kilometers to the west, the USS Buckley, DE-51, plowed through the heavy seas as part of the escort screen for convoy on 219. Lieutenant Commander Abel Johnson stood on the bridge of the destroyer escort, the wind and spray stinging his face as he studied the stormy horizon. At 36, Johnson was a Naval Academy graduate who had been called back to active duty after Pearl Harbor. Before the war, he had worked with the team developing the new QC sonar system. Captain, sonar reports possible contact, bearing 057, range uncertain due to sea conditions, reported Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Miller, the ship's sonar officer, his voice crackling through the voice tube. Acknowledged, Johnson replied. Maintain current speed. Continue tracking. Below decks in the sonar room, sonar technician First Class Robert Davis adjusted his headphones, focusing intently on the faint echoes returning through the water. Davis had been a music teacher in civilian life, his perfect pitch making him exceptionally skilled at distinguishing the subtle differences between ocean acoustics and man-made sounds. "Contact is firming up, sir," Davis reported to Lieutenant Miller. "Definitely metallic. Submarine-sized target moving at approximately 4 knots, depth estimated at 80 meters. Miller nodded. "Keep on it, Davis." He turned to the intercom. "Bridge, sonar. Contact is confirmed submarine, bearing 257, range now estimated at 4,000 yards. On the bridge, Johnson made his decision. "Helm, come to course 057. Maintain speed at 25 knots. Sound general quarters." The alarm klaxon wailed throughout the ship as sailors rushed to battle stations. The Buckley's 3-inch guns were manned, depth charge racks were prepared, and the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar was made ready. "Sir, at this speed, won't we lose the contact?" asked Ensign William Parker, the officer of the deck. Johnson allowed himself a small smile. "That's what they're counting on, Ensign. But our new QC sonar works just fine at speed. The Germans don't know that yet." The USS Buckley was one of 77 destroyer escorts of the Buckley class that had been rapidly constructed as part of America's massive wartime shipbuilding program. While smaller than fleet destroyers, these 400-ton vessels were purpose-built for anti-submarine warfare. Their QC sonar was the result of intense research and development by American and British scientists at the Naval Research Laboratory and Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory. The technical specifications were impressive. The QC sonar could detect submarines at ranges up to 500 yards under good conditions, and most importantly, it maintained effectiveness at speeds up to 30 knots, thanks to innovative streamlining of the sonar dome and advanced filtering systems that reduced self-noise. Previous sonar systems became essentially useless above 10 knots due to water flow noise overwhelming the sensitive hydrophones. Back on U-371, Hoffman was reviewing his charts when Schmidt approached with concern etched on his face. "Herr Callot, hydrophone reports propeller sounds, fast-moving vessel bearing 240. Sound signature suggests destroyer type, but it's moving too quickly to be using sonar." Hoffman frowned. "Distance? Difficult to determine precisely, but Heinrich estimates 4 to 5 kilometers and closing. It's probably just a routine patrol pattern," Hoffman reassured his executive officer. "They can't detect us at that speed, especially not in this sea state. The Americans would need to slow to under 10 knots to use their listening equipment effectively." This was the standard doctrine taught at the U-boat training school in Memel. All submarine commanders knew that active sonar, which the Germans called S-Gerät, sound apparatus, was rendered ineffective by a vessel's own noise once it exceeded certain speeds. This knowledge had formed the basis of U-boat evasion tactics since the beginning of the war. "Maintain current depth and speed," Hoffman ordered. "They'll pass overhead without detecting us. Once they're past, we'll continue to the rendezvous point." Aboard the Buckley, sonar technician Davis was providing continuous updates as they closed on the contact. "Range now 200 yards, sir. Target has not changed course or speed. They don't know we're here." Lieutenant Miller relayed this information to the bridge. Captain Johnson ordered the forward Hedgehog mount prepared for firing. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a preset depth and forced a submarine to the surface, the Hedgehog fired 24 small projectiles ahead of the ship in a circular pattern. They would only detonate on contact with the submarine's hull, causing less damage but offering a higher probability of a hit. "Sonar, Bridge. Can you get me an accurate firing solution?" Johnson asked. "Bridge, sonar. Contact is steady on bearing 057, range 500 yards, depth 80 meters. Solution is optimal. Johnson made his decision. Helm, maintain course and speed. Hedgehog crew, stand by to fire on my command. The USS Buckley continued its approach at 25 knots, the sonar maintaining contact despite the previously impossible speed. This capability represented a fundamental shift in the underwater battlefield equation, one that would cost hundreds of German submariners their lives before their command fully understood the new reality. In the U-boat, the sound of the approaching destroyer grew louder. Hoffman became increasingly concerned as the propeller noise intensified rather than passing overhead. "They're coming directly for us," Schmidt said, his voice tight. Hoffman's mind raced through the possibilities. Had they been spotted earlier? Was there a leak in their operational security? It shouldn't be possible for them to track a submerged U-boat at that speed. "Emergency dive. Take her down to 150 meters. Prepare for depth charges," Hoffman ordered sharply. The diving officer pushed the hydroplanes to their maximum angle as the U-boat nosed downward. The hull groaned under the strain of the rapid descent and changing pressure. "Passing 100 meters," reported the depth gauge operator. Above them, Captain Johnson gave the order, "Fire Hedgehog." With a series of pneumatic thumps, the 24 Hedgehog projectiles launched from the forward mount, ushing through the air before plunging into the sea in a pattern roughly 40 meters in diameter. Each 65-pound projectile sank quickly toward the calculated position of the U-boat. In the sonar room, Davis and the other operators listened intently. For several seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the sea. Then, a sharp metallic clang followed by a dull explosion. "Contact, sir. We have at least one hit," Miller reported excitedly. On the bridge, Johnson nodded grimly. "Helm, bring us around for another attack. Reload the Hedgehog." Inside U-371, chaos erupted as the projectile struck the pressure hull near the bow torpedo room. The explosion was not powerful enough to breach the hull completely, but it caused significant damage. Water began spraying through a damaged seam, and the lights flickered momentarily. "Damage report," Hoffman shouted over the confusion. "Hull breach in the forward torpedo room, taking on water. Torpedo tube 1 damaged beyond use," came the frantic reply from the torpedo officer. "Seal the compartment," Hoffman ordered. "All stop. Silent running." The U-boat's electric motors ceased turning, leaving the submarine in eerie silence except for the hiss of escaping air and the splash of water entering through the damaged hull section. The depth gauge showed 130 meters, well below their test depth of 100 meters. The pressure on the damaged hull was becoming dangerous. "How did they find us?" Schmidt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Hoffman admitted, equally quiet. "It shouldn't be possible at that speed." Above them, the Buckley was coming around for another attack. The QC sonar had momentarily lost contact when the U-boat went silent, but Davis's skilled ear picked up the sound of air escaping from the damaged submarine. "Contact re-established, sir. Bearing 062. Range approximately 1-200 yards. Target appears to be stationary." Captain Johnson considered his options. The Hedgehog had scored at least one hit, but the submarine was still intact. "Prepare depth charges. We'll make a direct pass this time." The Buckley accelerated to 30 knots, closing rapidly on the damaged U-boat's position. The depth charge settings were adjusted for 130 meters, the last reported depth of the submarine. In the U-boat, the sound of the approaching destroyer returned, even louder than before. "They're coming back," Schmidt said, his voice strained. Hoffman made a desperate decision. "Blow main ballast. Emergency surface. Prepare to abandon ship." The decision to surface was the last resort for a U-boat commander. It meant facing the destroyer's guns with only the submarine's small deck cannon as defense. But Hoffman knew his boat was damaged, at dangerous depth, and somehow being tracked with unprecedented accuracy. His priority now was to save his crew. As compressed air forced water from the ballast tanks, U-371 began to rise toward the surface. The control room was filled with tension as the depth gauge slowly unwound. 150 meters, 120 meters, 90 meters, 60 meters. On the Buckley, Davis reported the change. "Contact is rising rapidly, sir. They're surfacing." Johnson immediately adjusted his attack. "Belay depth charges. Prepare main battery. They're coming up." The destroyer's 3-inch guns and 20mm anti-aircraft cannons were trained toward the area where the submarine was expected to surface. The Buckley maintained its high speed, circling the position to be ready from any angle. U-371 broke the surface in a swirl of white water, its conning tower emerging first into the stormy night. Hoffman was the first up the ladder, pushing open the hatch to be met by driving rain and crashing waves. The submarine wallowed in the rough sea, its damaged bow riding low in the water. "Abandon ship!" Hoffman shouted down the hatch. "Everyone out! Life vests on!" Even as the German sailors began pouring onto the deck, the Buckley's searchlight caught them, the brilliant beam cutting through the darkness. The destroyer was approaching rapidly, its guns trained on the submarine. "Ceasefire!" Johnson ordered as he saw the Germans with hands raised. "Prepare boarding party. I want prisoners and intelligence materials." Man. The brutal efficiency of the American attack left Hoffman stunned. As he stood on the heaving deck of his dying U-boat, watching the destroyer approach with its guns trained on his vessel, the realization hit him with crushing force. The technological advantage had shifted decisively. If the Americans could now track submarines at high speed, the entire strategic calculation of the U-boat campaign was invalidated. 3 hours later, Hoffman sat in the wardroom of the USS Buckley, a blanket draped over his shoulders, a cup of hot coffee warming his hands. Across from him sat Captain Johnson, regarding the German commander with professional curiosity. "How did you find us?" Hoffman finally asked. "You were moving too fast for sonar to be effective." Johnson considered how much to reveal, then decided there was little harm. The evidence of the capability was already clear. "Our new sonar works at up to 30 knots, Oberleutnant. Has done for almost a year now." Hoffman's face paled. "Impossible. The water flow noise would be filtered out by our new QC systems." Johnson finished for him. "American engineering. We have over 200 vessels equipped with it now." The implication was clear. The U-boat's primary defensive tactic, relying on escort vessels' inability to use sonar at speed, was obsolete. Hoffman thought of his comrades still on patrol, still believing they were invisible when destroyers passed at high speed. The thought made him sick. "Your admiral doesn't know, does he?" Johnson asked. Though it wasn't really a question, Hoffman shook his head slightly. "If BDU knew, our tactics would have changed." The capture of U-371 and its crew represented more than just one submarine loss to the German Navy. It was a vital intelligence coup for the Allies and a turning point in the technological battle beneath the waves. Within 2 weeks of the incident, U-371's surviving crew members, including Hoffman, were transported to the POW camp at Fort Hunt, Virginia, known by the code name P.O. Box 1142. Unlike standard POW camps, Fort Hunt was a secret interrogation center where high-value prisoners were questioned for intelligence. Lieutenant Commander Albert Richards of Naval Intelligence studied Hoffman carefully across the table. The German officer had been treated well, fed, clothed, and given medical attention, but the psychological pressure of capture and the knowledge of what his revelation might mean for his comrades weighed heavily on him. "Let's continue our discussion about sonar capabilities, Oberleutnant," Richards said casually. "You mentioned yesterday that you were unaware of our ability to track submarines at high speed." Hoffman remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table. Richards continued, "We already have your first officer, Schmidt. He's been quite forthcoming about your operations out of La Palace, the patrol routes, the Wolfpack tactics, the communications protocols. This was a bluff. Schmidt had revealed nothing significant, but Hoffman didn't know that. The German commander's fingers tightened around the coffee cup in front of him. "I have nothing to say," Hoffman replied stiffly. Richards changed tactics. "We're not asking you to betray operational details, Oberleutnant. We already know those. What interests us is your assessment of how U-Boat Command would adapt if they knew about our sonar capabilities." This approach, appealing to Hoffman's analytical mind rather than asking for specific intelligence, opened a small crack in his resistance. "It would change everything," Hoffman said quietly. "The entire doctrine is based on the assumption that a submarine can evade detection when escorts are moving at speed." Richards nodded encouragingly. "And if that assumption is invalid, then the U-boat force is operating under a fatal miscalculation," Hoffman admitted. "It would explain the increasing losses in the Atlantic." The statistics supported his conclusion. U-boat losses had climbed dramatically throughout 1943. In May alone, 43 submarines had been lost, nearly 25% of the operational U-boat fleet at that time. German Naval Command attributed this to increased air coverage, radar improvements, and more escort vessels, but they had not identified the critical sonar advancement. Richards pressed further. "How would tactics change if Admiral Dönitz knew?" Hoffman hesitated, then made a decision. He was a naval officer, not a Nazi ideologue. The war was clearly turning against Germany, and the senseless loss of his fellow submariners, if it could be prevented, weighed on his conscience. "Deep running would become standard procedure," he explained. "Below 150 meters, when escorts are present, multiple depth changes during evasion. And Wolfpack tactics would have to be reconsidered entirely. They rely on U-boats, maintaining contact with convoys, to vector in other boats." Richards nodded, making notes. "And what about technical countermeasures?" There were experimental acoustic torpedoes being developed, the T5 Zaunkönig, designed to home in on propeller noise. If they could be deployed sooner, they might force escorts to reduce speed. Hoffman paused. There was also talk of acoustic decoys, devices that mimic submarine sounds to confuse sonar operators. This information was valuable but not revolutionary. Allied intelligence already knew about most of these developments. What they wanted was insight into the psychological impact this technological surprise would have on U-boat command. Meanwhile, back in the Atlantic, the U-boat war continued. U-257 and U-406, the other members of Hoffman's planned Wolfpack, proceeded to their rendezvous point, unaware that U-371 had been captured. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Wagner of U-257 was growing concerned. U-371 was now 18 hours overdue for radio check-in. Following protocol, he sent a brief encrypted message to U-boat headquarters. Wolfsfahle assembly incomplete. U-371 not responding. At BDU headquarters in the French coastal town of Kernevel, near Lorient, Admiral Dönitz reviewed the concerning reports from the North Atlantic. U-boat losses had reached unprecedented levels, and now U-371, one of his most reliable boats under one of his most experienced commanders, was missing. "What is happening out there?" he asked Korvettenkapitän Günther Hessler, his operations officer and son-in-law. Hessler studied the situation map, where small models represented known U-boat and convoy positions. "The weather should have favored our operations, Herr Admiral. The new escort vessels must have improved detection equipment." "That much is obvious," Dönitz replied impatiently. "But what improvements? How are they finding our boats?" The answer would not come from his staff, but from an unexpected source. 3 days after U-371's capture, a broken message was received from U-406. "Under attack. Destroyer maintained contact at high speed." Impossible. The message cut off abruptly, and U-406 was never heard from again. It had fallen victim to the same technological surprise that had caught U-371, a destroyer's ability to maintain sonar contact at speeds previously thought to render sonar ineffective. By February 1944, through multiple similar reports from surviving U-boats, the German Naval Command finally began to understand what they were facing. A directive was issued to all operational submarines. Evidence suggests Allied escorts can maintain sonar contact at speeds exceeding 20 knots. Adjust evasion tactics accordingly. Maintain depths below 150 meters when escorts are present. But the warning came too late for hundreds of submariners. The technological edge had shifted decisively, and the U-boat arm never recovered its effectiveness. By May 1945, of the 162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 had been lost. A casualty rate of 68%, the highest of any combat arm on any side during World War II. For Hoffman, the war ended in captivity. He remained at Fort Hunt until early 1944, when he was transferred to a regular POW camp in Arizona. There, he received a letter from Schmidt, who'd been sent to a different camp. "The Americans treated our wounded with the same care as their own men," Schmidt wrote. "Their medic worked for hours to save Miller's arm. It makes me wonder about all we were told regarding our enemies." This experience mirrored that of thousands of captured German submariners, who found that the barbaric Americans described by Nazi propaganda were instead professional military men who treated prisoners humanely. This cognitive dissonance, like the shocking discovery of superior Allied technology, forced many to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about the war they were fighting. After the war, Hoffman returned to Germany to find his homeland in ruins. He eventually became a merchant marine officer, using his naval experience in peacetime shipping. In 1954, he was invited to the United States for a naval technology conference, where he met Robert Davis, the sonar operator who had first detected U-371. The two former enemies shared a drink at the hotel bar, discussing the technological battle that had played out beneath the Atlantic waves. "We never stood a chance, did we?" Hoffman asked reflectively. Davis considered this. "Not in the long run, no. American industry produced 563 destroyer escorts during the war. Germany built 162 U-boats total. We were commissioning escort vessels faster than you could sink them, sometimes at a rate of 4 per week. The numbers were staggering. While Germany had struggled to replace lost U-boats, American shipyards had launched 175 destroyer escorts in 1943 alone. By 1944, the production rate had increased to nearly 1 per day. But it wasn't just quantity, Davis continued. It was innovation. The QC sonar was just one example. We had magnetic anomaly detection for aircraft. We had forward-throwing hedgehogs. We had microwave radar that your detection equipment couldn't pick up. It was a scientific war as much as a military one. Hoffman nodded slowly. We suspected some of these developments, but BDU refused to believe the reports from surviving boats. Dönitz insisted that our losses were due to operational errors, not technological inferiority. It was easier to blame the commanders than to admit the strategic situation had changed. This failure to adapt to technological realities was repeated throughout the German military. From the underestimation of Allied radar capabilities to the surprise of encountering superior Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front, German leadership often dismissed intelligence that contradicted their preconceptions. The story of the QC sonar and its impact on the U-boat campaign illustrates a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Technological superiority can render courage, skill, and experience irrelevant. The bravery of U-boat crews was never in question. They faced some of the harshest conditions of any combat personnel, but they were ultimately defeated by American engineering and industrial might. For every advance in German submarine technology, the Allies produced multiple countermeasures. When U-boats began using the snorkel to run diesel engines while submerged, the Allies developed radar that could detect the small snorkel mast. When acoustic torpedoes threatened Allied escorts, engineers quickly developed noisemakers to decoy the weapons away from ships. The QC sonar represented just one link in this chain of technological leapfrogging, but it was a crucial one. By invalidating a fundamental assumption of U-boat tactics, that high-speed escorts couldn't maintain sonar contact, it transformed the underwater battlefield in ways that German commanders were slow to recognize. As Hoffmann and Davis parted ways after their conversation, the German offered a final observation. The greatest weapon the Allies had wasn't the sonar or the aircraft or even your massive production capability. It was the willingness to listen to your frontline personnel and adapt quickly. When a destroyer captain reported something worked, your admirals believed him. When our commanders reported new Allied capabilities, our leaders called them cowards or defeatists. This insight, that organizational flexibility and willingness to adapt are as important as technological innovation itself, remains relevant in military operations to this day. The American ability to rapidly develop, test, produce and deploy new technologies created an insurmountable advantage that no amount of German engineering genius or submarine crew bravery could overcome. The capture of U-371 in December 1943 was just one small episode in the vast naval campaign of World War II, but it encapsulated the technological surprise that helped turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. For Karl Hoffmann and his crew, the discovery that American destroyers could track them at 30 knots came too late. For hundreds of their comrades still at sea, it would prove fatal. Today, the technological cat-and-mouse game between submarines and anti-submarine forces continues, with ever more sophisticated sensors, quieter submarines, and advanced signal processing. But the fundamental lesson of the QC sonar remains. In warfare, what you don't know can kill you. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.